thank you all for being here and welcome you to the First Media Center. I'm Rex Smith, the editor of the Times-Union, and I'm happy to say that this is the latest example of our opportunity to create what we call live journalism, a way to bring newsmakers and policy conversations, important conversations, to a live presentation here, so that we are not just a journalism entity that puts ink on crushed trees, though that part of our work is still important. We also believe that we can deliver live experiences in journalism that will then turn into reported stories. So we thank you for being a part of that, and you'll have your opportunity to be a part of that because some of the questions that you submitted earlier are going to be part of the conversation later on. So we're very grateful to you today. Also, the gratitude we also extend to Catherine Graziano of Remax Platinum Realtors in North Greenbush. Catherine, if you would just wave here, thank you very much. The sponsor of this morning's event. So thank you for this really wouldn't be possible without sponsorship. So that's one of the things that we're in the for-profit journalism world, as the profit part has diminished significantly over the years, we've been happy to do that. This space is part of our commitment to being the center of community conversation, and our publisher George Hurst saw this as being an opportunity for us to expand what we do, and that's what we're trying to do with this. I should say that I hope you will, if this is the first time that you've come to one of our events here, I hope you'll consider some more. We had a great conversation last week over lunch with the heads of Proctor's, SPAC, and the Palace about the creative economy and the impact of the arts on that. Coming up later this month, we'll have a Times-Union leadership luncheon with Dr. Shirley Ann Jackson, the president of RPI. That should be an interesting conversation, don't you think? So we look forward to this and to more such conversations. And today we're very grateful to have the regional administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency with us, Pete Lopez. The person who is running the show here, who's making this happen, is Casey Seiler, our senior editor for news. Casey, for many years, ran our state capitol bureau and was in charge of our political and governmental coverage. Prior to that, he was the Times-Union's arts and entertainment editor. So we asked him to go cover politics because we thought, in this town, what's more entertaining? Why not send the entertainment editor? What is a better stage than what's going on down at the Capitol? So he's going to bring some of that sensibility, we hope, to this. And Casey, thank you. There you go.
Thank you, Rex. Thanks very much. And thank you all very much for coming. I would like to introduce our guest, and please, you should come up and join me. Pete Lopez serves as the regional administrator. Sure. Yes. Always a good start. Serves as the regional administrator for EPA Region 2, one of 10 regional districts under the federal agency. His responsibilities include overseeing the states of New York and New Jersey, including 8 tribal nations, as well as the Commonwealths of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, which I'm sure will take up some of our conversation this morning. Lopez comes to the job after more than a decade as a state assembly member in I think it's fair to say, a rural and somewhat sprawling district, where his assignments included the Environmental Conservation Committee and the Task Force on Food, Farm, and Nutrition Policy. He was in his 6th term last September when it was announced he would take his new post, and we were discussing backstage, we think you are the only member of the legislature who has gone on to a federal agency as the new administration took over. His resume also includes a number of local elected posts as well as senior staff positions in the state legislature. When news of the appointment broke, his predecessor is Region 2 Administrator Judith Enck, who I was surprised to learn last September oversaw your work when you were an intern at Environmental Advocates. How many years ago was that? Oh, here we go.
Sure.
There, try that.
Test check.
Perfect.
That was in 1981.
Okay.
So a few years ago.
Okay, all right. Judith Enck said, I think he is smart, I think he cares about the environment, and I think he'll be respectful of career staff at the agency. Lopez is a graduate of Schoharie Central School District, SUNY Cobleskill, and UAlbany. You hold a bachelor's in public affairs with a concentration in environmental studies and a master's degree in public administration. I would also like to note that your lovely wife, Bridget, woke early this morning to join us. I think she deserves a hand as well.
I agree.
So my first question to you is, how did you get this gig? Were you recruited? Did you throw your hat into the ring, as it were?
So you just announced her. So
Yes.
so it was Bridget. So ironically, when the transition occurred, there was just a all call, for lack of a better term, that said, if you're interested, you want to apply, do so. So Bridget's words were, let's explore. So we put my hat in the ring. We went through the portal, I guess that's the most appropriate term. And it was kind of a long and convoluted process, but almost probably the better part of a year, really, from the time we submitted the application to the time we had an acknowledgement. I think we submitted the application December, maybe, and then
Of 2016?
correct.
Yeah.
And then I don't think we had word, any real world word until May or June, an indication of interest. So, and then things moved from there.
Was there a certain sense you have been, you were Republican in the Democrat-dominated state assembly throughout your entire tenure? Was there a sense that after years and years of working within the minority, and stuff definitely can get done, that it would be nice to be sort of on the leadership side, as it were?
I guess there's a part of that, but to be honest, in my work prior to that, I'd worked with the Senate as well. So I'd worked for, my first employment was with Senator Charlie Cook, who represented the Catskill region. I also worked for John Bonasek, a little bit for Randy Poole when I was on the Agriculture Committee. That's where I think Julie Suarez, where's Julie? Julie Suarez actually followed me as staff to Senator Poole with the Agriculture Committee. And so from my standpoint, I wouldn't say that was as much the issue as other than I had been in Albany for 30 some odd years. And I thought it was time for a change. And it just seemed that the timing was right to try something different. So again, I had worked either as staff or as a member for 30 some odd years. So time was right.
Was there any, and this is sort of starting off with one of the tougher questions, was there any trepidation on your part, considering that the Trump administration and the EPA administrator, Scott Pruitt, who was named rather early, had drawn kind of considerable controversy in the first few months of the administration? I assume the period, if June was about the time that you were getting a response and really actively pursuing the job, that's the same month that the administration was pulling out of the Paris Accords, which of course drew considerable criticism. There has been repeated talk about budget cuts within the agency. In other words, as you're applying for a job with EPA, you're also kind of seeing these headlines kind of roll out.
Well, I would say all of us, no one could be oblivious to that. But I guess from my standpoint, it's really a function of engagement. It's a function of immersion. So I'm not afraid of controversy. I've lived through floods, we've lived through pipelines, we've lived through hydrofracking, we've lived through any number of issues that we've lived through, massive budget deficits, austerity budgets. So controversy to me and some degree of adversity is not something that I'm afraid of. I'm not concerned about it. To me, the honest answer is engagement. And for me, that has been at the grassroots level. And I'm a person who believes, I'm a policy person. So I like to engage people. I use a phrase from an old pastor, constructive tension. And what the pastor meant is that we come from different worldviews, different philosophies, if you would, different points of view, but we may have the same goal. And ultimately, if you give people a chance to engage and have time with each other, work through those issues, ultimately you'll arrive at a conclusion, in my opinion, a result that is in everyone's best interest and is most reflective of the world as a whole. It's not just a segment. And I'll use agriculture as a brief example. So very passionate about farms and forestry and agriculture. I grew up in rural Schoharie County. And as I did my work in the assembly in particular, I would put newsletters together, and I'll try to wind this up quickly. But the response I had, many of our newsletters, they would have these rhetorical sound bites, and that, to me, that's a challenge for our community, because when that happens, that means we've lost our ability to communicate if we resort to a sound bite. So I had a person write back to me and said, Peter, I like your newsletter, because I would write them myself. I like the content of it, I like the direction, but you had this sound bite that just made you sound like a conservative Republican. And I thought, okay, all right, I get that. And in our newsletters, we're not allowed to list our political affinity. That's not appropriate. But the person agreed with me on the substance of the discussion. And so what I found, I'll use agriculture, and Julie will get this. Bridget understands this, she grew up on a farm. So we'll have two vocabularies, two sets of dialects, if you would. So one will say land grant colleges, unit productivity, dollars generated at the farm gate, tradition. All right, so that's one dialect. Another dialect will say carbon footprint, sustainability, 100-mile diet, safe food, local food. So in my opinion, and this is what I try to do when I engage, is I look for what's the common denominator that unites us. So in the case of agriculture, it's family farms. And that was made very apparent to me. I had a conversation with a constituent in Socrates who approached me and said, at the time we were struggling to get subsidies for dairy farmers who had seen their milk prices fall. And there's a cyclical nature. Dairy farmers and many farmers struggle because they're price takers. They don't generate prices. So the comment from the constituent was, I really don't want money to subsidize dairy farmers. I want money for farmland protection. And I said, ma'am, I get that. I understand that. I said, in Socrates and high growth areas, there's pressure for development and you want to preserve land. And so we had that long conversation about the two dialects and about all the things that are important about family farms. And when we finished, I said to her, again, I support you on the land preservation side, but what good is it to have the land if the family farm that we value, the family farm and their engagement, what good is it to have them have the land if the family farm can't make a living, if they're not economically viable? At which point she said, you know, you're right. And so my premise is, with patience, with conversation, with intelligent and thoughtful conversation, you can arrive at a point where the controversy becomes more of a strength. It becomes just a forum for engagement, and you work through those issues. And so long story short, I wasn't concerned, because to me, I'm going to be myself. I'm going to communicate. I'm going to do what I always do. We're going to love people, and I love everyone, some more than others. I guess that goes with the nature of the engagement. So to me, it's more substantive engagement. What are the issues? What are the concerns? Let's get things off our chest. And invariably, and I can say this too from my work as a local official and as an assemblyman, no one would come to my office casually. Usually people come and they're charged up for any number of reasons. It might be financial, it might be a philosophical issue, they may be frightened. So my penchant is we let people vent first. Let's hear what you have to say, hear your concerns, your issues, your priorities. And then when we finish with that, then let's have a substantive discussion on how we resolve the issue.
There's also...
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
okay.
right.
Sorry for the long-winded.
No. So what you're talking about is basically kind of trying to come to consensus within kind of competing ideologies, I think,
That's
right?
the world we live in.
Right.
Yeah.
There is also, of course, the question of resources that are available, available to the family farmer, available as well to federal agencies. There has been much criticism of a significant reduction in EPA's budget that we have seen in proposal after proposal. The latest one, I think, that just came out last month, proposes a 23% decrease. Was that a concern to you coming aboard? Because I think that's been consistent all the way down the line.
Yeah, I would say, and again, I've worked with scarcity, so the world I come from, and for those who know the Catskills, I come from Northern Appalachia. So scarcity is not an issue. So we learn how to deal with scarcity. And again, in the assembly minority in particular, you understand scarcity. So you become quite nimble. So you learn how to put pieces together. So to me, and again, I went through 3 governors, I forget in how many years, but in the height of that, with Governor Patterson, we were facing a $12 billion deficit in the budget. So scarcity was on everyone's plate. That was not an issue. So long story short, I wasn't so worried about a percentage cut as I was about the ability of the team as a whole to effectively carry out their mission. And if anything, I've seen that reinforced. So Administrator Pruitt, for example, has reinforced the primacy of EPA with Superfund. So when you think about it, and think about the complexity and the cost, we have some situations that are tens, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars of cost with highly technical, complex situations. There's no one really better positioned to address that than EPA. Some of our states are very capable, but EPA is really, when it comes to Superfund, NPL listings, mitigation of toxic situations, whether it's Love Canal or Gowanus, or the list goes on, Passaic, Hudson, he's reinforced that. So to me, I take strength from that, and then I focus on what else is there with our mission that we need to focus on, and do we have the resources and capability? So a cut itself, to me, is a cut. The issue is how does it translate into the organization and its ability to carry out its mission?
This is the way, your appointment was announced on September 28th. Hurricane Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico that you knew was going to become your bailiwick exactly 7 days before that, 8 days, I guess it was. Did you have second thoughts? As I'm sure the press release was being drafted. I mean, when you were applying for the job, of course, no one could have known that that such an environmental catastrophe was going to be visited on a significant part of your district.
I would say no second thoughts. If anything, it was galvanizing. So just to put in perspective, so in my prior experience, I had been in the epicenter of Irene and Lee.
Yep.
So in that situation, 6 of my 7 counties were in states of emergency. My home village was flooded. My parents were homeless. They had 8 feet of water in their home. My staff homeless. And so I was thrown into a situation of having to be on the ground, trying to make sense of chaos and trying to help people build their lives. And that walk still continues. We're, I think, almost 7 years out. And still there are scars of that in the region. So for me, Irene and Lee were personal. Ironically, my father's from Kamui. He's a native born. I was born in Miami, lived in this region most of my life, but we have family there. So ironically, Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands became an extension of my home valley. So it was personal for me. So professional, emotional, but also galvanizing personally for me.
We were just talking backstage. My colleague at New York Now and WMHT, Matt Ryan, was mentioning that he vividly remembers following you around in the wake of Irene and Lee, and noting that it was remarkable to see you at work, that it was kind of a classic case of what a public servant should be about in a disaster. But I know for you, it also affected your family. That there were times when you were worried about the safety of your own household as well during that.
Yes, and I'm going to say first, thank you for a public servant. So I get hit with the politician piece a lot, and there's a difference, and I ascribe to public servant. There's a meaning to that. And when we talk about family, this is part of my philosophy. So when I think of family, we think of the nuclear family, and then to me, they're concentric rings. So it spreads out to extended family, to your home village, and beyond. So as I do my work, I really view my entire constituency as family. So back to that point, back to Matt, my engagement with Matt, my goal was to try to fill in gaps because the resources were available, but the issue was how do we connect resources, maybe a Senate or congressional appropriation, how do we get that to where it needs to be? So that was really my role.
Here's the headline from the New Republic in October, just a couple of weeks after you took the job. Trump's pick for Puerto Rico's environmental cleanup might actually do the right thing. And the subhead was, is there room in EPA leadership for someone who cares about the environment and public health? Now, that definitely comes from the sort of more progressive side of the media.
I think there was another one that said it could be worse. So I don't know, I kind of take that with a grain of salt,
Yeah.
but you know, that one I got a giggle out of. But thank you. And again, it's, you know, they make reference to Judith. I knew her as Judy with an environmental planning lobby at the time, and that to me was, I wanted to be a park manager. That's what I was trying to do, except I was not so thoughtful about the economics. There were no jobs. So when I graduated, I was working at Genghis Formal Wear after finishing my bachelor's, looking for work.
That's a real glide path, I think, to
It
work in the EPA, working at Genghis Formal Wear.
so I had scrubbed floors and scraped fish and whatever it took to get through school. But the thing I reflected on in the midst of helping measure someone for their suit was the work with environmental planning lobby. I thought, well, I haven't, and the environmental piece came through where I grew up. Again, being close to farms, being scouting movement in particular, very focused on stewardship and citizenship. That motivation and the work with EPL led me to knock on every door in the legislature. So if you can imagine, so here's a half Puerto Rican, English, Scotch, Dutch, German country boy, no political background, no pedigree, no resources, no prior engagement, and Charlie Cook, and I thank Charlie to this day, and for those who have never met Charlie, you missed a great person. Charlie, I was even the wrong party. I was a registered independent. My parents were Democrats at the time. He was a Republican. Charlie gave me an opportunity, and what I loved most about that was he saw something in me, and in the midst of this political world, his action was really not political. And even in my first run for village office in Schoharie at age 21, there are no parties. So when you run in the village, I was just running as Pete. So that engagement has really stayed with me. I remember our roots. So back to the environmental side.
You know, certainly the federal response.
I do this a lot.
The federal response, you know, did sustain heavy criticism, especially in the early days.
Yeah.
You know, what was your response to that? I think even to this day, there's I think 15% of the island that's out of power.
Regardless of who was in administration, it's predictable. So when I was in the village of Schoharie and I walked out, and I saw my family and friends all coming out to the common green on the main street. It was as if it was a war zone. People were stunned. They were speechless. There was no communication. We were back to the Stone Age. There was no communications. In Schoharie's case, unlike many of the others, the entire governmental structure was wiped out. So everything was gone. And so the biggest challenge was, despite the rapid response, and this is the point I'm trying to drive home, is you can have all these resources floating around, but they're like life rafts in the ocean. So if someone's swimming and they can't get to the life raft, they're going to suffer. So it took time to connect the resources with the need. And so when I saw the criticism, I thought, oh, I'm sorry that we're going in that direction, but it's predictable because the resources don't instantly land in the home, in the business, where the need is the greatest. It takes time to filter through. And that's an institutional issue. It's not a political issue. It's more of an issue of working through bureaucracy and documenting and justifying the use of public tax dollars. So that was a painful progression to see that, but predictable.
FEMA was the lead agency in the recovery on the island. What, if you could sort of summarize kind of the top 3 or 4 jobs that EPA had in those immediately, the immediate, couple of weeks or even 2 or 3 months after the storm struck? So
the immediate challenge, and I think this will resonate, is you protect public health and human life. So EPA's mission, of course, environmental, they need water. So the Spanish translation, if I were to say water is life, agua es vida, what do you do without water? What do you do without drinking water? What do you do without water to cook with and clean with? So our first focus was on how do we restore basic services for human existence. So where water systems were not functioning, we were trying to provide generators, we were trying to do emergency repairs. We're working with FEMA and Army Corps to bring supplies, even if we were the first point of contact, particularly in the mountainous regions, running out to inspect supplies and get them working again. So water systems, sewer systems to protect against disease. And then the list goes on, hazardous waste, vegetative debris. You have to have a place to take all this massive debris, clear roads and bridges, and take a place to dispose of it. Vessels, we had thousands of vessels that were sunk, many of whom had gasoline and diesel and other things that were environmentally.
You talk boats, basically.
Boats, yeah.
Sunk.
Yeah, I guess that's Coast Guard technical speak, vessels. So boats, yeah. But hazardous household waste, you name it, the list. Think about all the things that would affect human health and the environment, locking down Superfund sites, making sure that, and again, we had the issue with the misconception of water from the Dorado well site, which made national news. And that turned out to be...
Explain that a little bit, if you would.
Yeah, so in essence, there was a reporting of individuals in desperation drinking water from a Superfund site area, the Dorado Superfund site area. What was not known to the community was that the infrastructure throughout the island, the process, the water system, ran lines throughout that region. So they had water lines, pressurized water lines with chlorine, treated water running through the region. They happened to have access to the wells at the site, access to the water lines at the site where these wells were locked down. So our main goal was to make sure that the sites were locked down, provide drinking water. So we had Army Corps coming out with water tanks, we had bottled water, as we made sure that there was no linkage between the Superfund site and the wells that had been cut off, sealed off, and the water that they were accessing. Ultimately, with testing, immediate testing, it was the process water supply, there was chlorine residual in the water. You don't have that in an abandoned Superfund well, you have something else. But it took a while for that, and again, that was very emotional. So I think that brought me to Congress at least 3 times to testify before Congress. And again, it's an emotional issue. But so the main thing was public health and safety, and that's where we focused, and we continue to focus on that.
I want to mix in some of the audience questions as we just kind of on a subject by subject basis. So one that we got, is the U.S. doing everything possible to help Americans living in Puerto Rico?
I would say yes, and here's the challenge with Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. So as we look at what Maria did to Texas, horrifying. Look at what it did to Florida, equally horrifying. The challenge for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, you have communities that are effectively insolvent. So Puerto Rico was facing a $75 billion deficit even before the storm. And again, parallels to Northern Appalachia. And this was part of my testimony before Congress, is the less resource the community has, the poorer the community, the longer and more torturous the path to recovery. So the federal government, and particularly we've worked hard in EPA, and EPA had a relationship before, has been very focused on capacity building. So helping local governments, supporting home rule, providing infusions of funds. So I would say from what I've seen and from our engagement, we're doing everything we can, and we're actually pushing the envelope, trying to find ways to provide more resources, even where we have statutory limitations.
Another question, this might not be something that you could address, but another audience question was, what will it take to rebuild Puerto Rico with a renewable and more sustainable power grid system? That might be something for another agency to take up.
Not really. I'll throw a few aspects in first. So first is endurance and patience. And the third thing I would say is vision and a willingness to do a little risk taking. And so when I say that, and this is common to any storm event, and we saw this with Irene and Lee, the instant desire is to rush in and fix things, put it back the way it was, get homes and businesses, get infrastructure back in place, get systems working. The challenge is, and we've had this conversation in my home valley as much as in Puerto Rico, is what do you do different to protect life and property in the future?
The line is never let a catastrophe go to waste, that type of
Yeah, you could say that. You could say that. And I'm going to say it for 2 reasons. Because there are costs. So the first is the financial cost. I can remember sitting in Prattsville in the northern Catskills with FEMA, and they were reflecting on Katrina, which was recent in their minds. And the word was, we can't keep doing this over and over again. We can't keep pouring billions of dollars in, putting people back in place only to be hurt again. So there's a real financial impact, but there's also an emotional impact. And when we do this, if we put people back where they were, and I see one of my neighbors here, also from Schoharie, a dear friend who also is part of the same community. We put people back where they were, knowing that an event may happen again. All we're doing is dooming them to more hardship. And when Irene hit, people questioned whether they stay. So we had Sandy looking to hit again. And so people were questioning, do we stay? And Puerto Rico, the same thing, and Virgin Islands, do we stay? And so the only way we stay is if we can take fear. No one should have to live in fear. So to the extent that we can provide resources, be thoughtful with our restructuring, harden our assets, move people who are in risk out of areas of risk, then we have a chance for the community to recover and for people to stay. So there's opportunity, but it's going to boil down to, can the agencies and the Commonwealth and the leadership be willing to take that extra walk? And I'll use the non-process system. So process, the major water supplier in Puerto Rico, the non-process, or just an amalgamation of 200 and some odd small independent water systems, many of whom are not even functioning legally. They weren't functioning legally before the storm. As we rebuild them, we're putting generators in place for backup systems. We're installing solar systems in some cases. We're talking about, back to process, we're talking about moving, incredibly Dorado, there's conversation moving them out of the floodplain because their system was inundated.
Similar to Prattsville, where people have had to move out of
Correct.
floodplain areas.
So my sense is, and I'll use Schoharie. Schoharie, it was brought to my attention, has been destroyed 11 times since its inception. That came from one of our historians. Fires, floods, any number of reasons. It's come back, but it's been different. So the community shapes and molds itself around the pressures and tries to rebuild in a way that it can sustain itself over time. And that's the issue with Puerto Rico. But that takes creativity too, and some risk taking.
I thought it's significant that you said people should not have to live in fear. So much of the work that EPA does is, tends to engage with people's worst fears. The idea that not just a visible, but perhaps an invisible contaminant is posing a danger to the individual's health, as well as, and even more agonizingly, the possibility of your family, your children. Nowhere in this region, I think it's fair to say, has that been felt more than in Rensselaer County, specifically in Hoosick Falls, with the great controversy over PFOA contamination. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but EPA essentially is overseeing or essentially taking, at this point, a backseat to state oversight. DEC and DOH is effectively in the driver's seat on the remediation, the recovery, and the research on those sites. Is that fair to say?
So I wouldn't use the term backseat.
Right.
I would say maybe wing.
Okay.
How's that? So certainly DEC and DOH have primacy in terms of environmental and health response. The EPA,
Which has been the case going back to the initiation of the crisis.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so EPA plays a supportive role. We backstop, we support, we engage. And I was just on the phone with Basil Sagos, the commissioner of DEC, just within last week on this issue. I was just had a phone call for the first time, my first engagement with the mayor in Hoosick Falls. And so our engagement, and we're going to be working on this more aggressively, is to again, help support and bring various groups together. So from my standpoint, and this goes back to my engagement as a local official, ultimately we need to respect the primacy and the responsibility of the home rule officials. So the mayor of the village, the town, to some extent the county. And we want to provide support and resources that allow them to understand the issue, one. understand the pervasiveness of the issue, 2, and then understand and be a support in providing the resources needed to effect a solution. And all of that with the common view that we want people to be at peace. We want them to be free of fear. And so that's a collective response. I can't say that someone's has a superior position over another. It's really a collective effort. We just happen to have somebody who's on point at one time or another. But our mission is very straightforward. We want to understand the nature of contamination. We want to understand the extent of contamination. We want to understand the remediation effort requirements. And then we want to be part of a solution that brings those resources to bear.
Is that problematic, kind of giving local officials or even state officials kind of primacy over an issue like that? In the case of Hoosick Falls, there was significant criticism that local officials were not doing enough to warn people about the potential danger from the contamination. And finally, I believe it was Judith Anka, it was EPA that kind of forced the hand of local officials at, I believe it was the end of 2015, by saying, you know what, our advice is this water is not safe to drink.
Sure. So the simple answer to that is we have a mission and an obligation, just as the municipal officials have a mission and an obligation. If our mission is compromised because a partner is not acting properly, we have an obligation to conduct our mission. So we're not always in agreement with our state partners, our federal partners, our local partners. That goes back to that issue of trying to manage constructive tension. We do have a mission, and so our mission is to make sure that homeowners, business owners, community is safe. That doesn't begin and end with a municipal boundary, but I feel that we're strongest when we respect the hierarchy, the structure of decision-making that's in place. Again, when I was a local official, I can remember having a state official in my backyard on an issue that was really germane to the town. I was very offended. And I thought, I've got this in hand, I'm working on it. You haven't even talked to me, and you're out engaging my community on an issue that you should at least be talking to me. So that was my purpose for speaking to the mayor just this morning, is to say, Mayor, I know there are a lot of forces, a lot of people, a lot of energy around this issue, but I feel it's my obligation to at least have a personal knowledge and relationship of you as the chief elected for the village of Hoosick Falls. I think that's respectful and it's appropriate. We're going to go from there. I don't know what happens, but my expectation is I'll find a person who's thoughtful and engaged and wants their community to be safe, and we'll be on the same course. But you have to give them their due and their respect.
There is, of course, well, actually, there is another controversy, of course, closer to home around here, and that is the ongoing work removing PCBs from the Hudson, specifically.
Somehow I knew you'd get to that.
Yes, exactly, sooner or later.
Just felt it coming.
Yes.
My spidey senses were going on.
Your spidey senses are keen as always. We're talking about a 40-mile stretch of the Hudson. EPA, in this instance, is very much the lead agency. Just a month ago, a joint report from U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and New York State DEC found that while PCB levels had dropped, they are still well above federal and state thresholds for health. They still remain in significant concentration in fish, for example. This region, and I would say probably the rest of the state, is currently awaiting EPA's report on whether or not GE needs to do more or should be given. Here we're talking about a paper chase from GE's perspective, and that is a certificate of completion. If you want to make a huge amount of news today, I would invite you to do so, but where is that process at this point, and yes or no, will GE get a certificate of completion?
So, Casey, I have to tell you, my wife and I were just observing that you were looking like a senior editorial presence. We were appreciating that, so I'm not surprised at your request. The one thing I would say, and it's not new news, this is commonly known, that EPA is taking a pause, and we're taking a pause really at the request of our state colleague, DEC, which has provided some 1,800 additional samples, sediment samples to review. I can tell you that my goal, and this has been embraced by DEC, and I have Gary Klawinski, who's our lead on Superfund, and Larissa Romanowski, also our community engagement. They've been very much on the forefront of this. What we're doing now is working to make sure that we are very deliberative in this process. So as you mentioned, this has been an ongoing process. This process doesn't begin and end with 40 miles in the upper reaches of the Hudson.
Sure.
So just to be clear, so the remediation followed a consent decree, a record of decision. There was a scope of work laid out. There's been about $1.5 billion spent in dredging. There have been studies pre and post in the sediment and the fish population. That continues. The EPA determination with the certificate, and just to bear in mind that there are really two certificates over the life of any participating party's engagement. The certificate of remedial action, which is the scope of work that was required by the consent decree and the record of decision, specific things to do at EPA request.
That's basically, have you done what you said you were going to do?
At EPA's direct request and supervision.
And then the final certificate of completion would be,
The
was that enough?
And that certificate is the certificate of completion of the work, which would say the Hudson is remediated, you've done everything.
Right.
And so as we look at that upper stretch, we also are engaged with floodplain analysis. So we are now doing soil sampling, some 8,000 samples of soil.
This was an audience question I was just about to
Correct.
read.
And with that, and this was part of the conversation with DEC, that includes the abandoned canal stretches. That is being included in the floodplain portion. So that's not part of the actual dredging of the functioning waterway. That's being treated in with the floodplain analysis.
And that's
So any
basically
mitigation-
because EPA does not have the jurisdiction to order or compel dredging for navigational purposes. Is that correct?
Yeah, we have limitations in terms of what we can do, but I guess conceptually, just for the group to know, so we focus on the 40-mile stretch or so in the Upper Hudson. The remediation, was it sufficient? Is it meeting its targets? Is the fish population recovering? What do the soil samples look like? The sediment samples in the waterway? That's what's going on now. In concert with that, we have the soil samples in the floodplain. That may yield additional work to be undertaken. There may be further remediation that occurs. Beyond that, and this is what we're gearing up for next, is the stretch below the Troy Dam. And that there had been some initial analysis of that, but that will be, we're going to go back and revisit. And at that point, there may be more PCBs, there may not, there may be other contaminants, and there may be other parties involved. And so this I use that term endurance. This is really a marathon. This is not a sprint set. So part of the challenge, and this is part of our engagement too, is I've been learning. So as a legislator, I represented much of upper portions of the Hudson. I had Columbia, Greene, Ulster, Albany. So the Hudson River was known quantity to me, engagement in the Hudson River. But it's been instructive for me to work with the staff as we get into the detail and understand the biology, the chemistry, the dynamic. And this is one piece that we continue to struggle with. So, and this is the best analogy, is when I look at Superfund sites or intervention, I use the analogy of a human body and surgery. So we have a patient who's suffering, we do an interdiction, surgery. Then we have to step back and assess what's happened with that surgery and what other processes are at work that return the patient to their normal healthy condition. So that's the best analogy I can use here. It's a living organism. The river itself is not devoid of other aspects that affect fish population and then ultimately human health. So long story short, we're pausing. We're working to assess if there's any new information that we need to act on, and just encouraging everyone to understand that we don't walk away, we're here for the long haul, and we want to remediate the Hudson in its entirety.
Is there any sense of how long the pause, as you put it, will last for?
As long as it takes to be thorough. So just 2 weeks ago, I helped convene a technical meeting between DEC scientists and EPA scientists to focus on the methodology, the sampling methodology, the assumptions, the parameters, because from my standpoint, I wanted to make sure, again, back to dialects, that we were speaking the same language. So, and my early training was in science-led technology. I have enough to be dangerous. Not an expert. Gary knows that. I'm a little dangerous. I make him a little nervous at these meetings, especially. But Larissa. What I wanted to make sure that there was an apple-to-apple comparison, because ultimately, once everyone agrees with the findings, the next question is, what are the conclusions? What are the policy choices? What follows? So if we're disjointed with the analysis and the assumptions, and we're at loggerheads there, the prospect of coming to a collaborative result is going to be much more difficult. So we're going to take as long as it takes to feel that we've been rigorous with our analysis, and we've turned over every piece of evidence that we need to be confident with our result.
So if GE...
I've spoken like a scientist.
If GE is staring at the mailbox waiting for the certificate of completion to show up, it's going to be a very, very long wait.
Well, I can't, we're working deliberately. We're not, again, there's no intent to hold anyone up. And to GE's credit, GE has been very faithful in the execution of their duties. When they've been asked to perform a duty, they've done it. They're patiently waiting for a result. But mind you, again, the world we live in is very litigious. So at any time, we could be sued from one interest group or another. I can't be concerned about that. I have to be concerned
I believe
about
the governor has said that
Sure.
if a certificate of completion is awarded, that the state will sue.
Yeah, so from my standpoint, I can't be paralyzed by the prospect of litigation on either side. I have to do my job. And I learned this during the floods. When I was mucking out my parents' house, and I was running, I had an opponent attacking me. It was the middle of a campaign season, and I'm helping my communities. I realized that if I'm more concerned about keeping my job than doing my job, I can't do my job. So I'm just going to do my job. We're going to be thorough, we're going to be rigorous, we're going to be as inclusive as we can, we're going to bring as much information as we can to make the best decision with the information at hand.
But so you mentioned the floodplain.
So no news flash, but at least some more insight.
Darn it. An audience question, could you explain the examination of the floodplains in the Hudson, including the original canal? You mentioned it, but is that effectively a strategy to look at the canal and having something of the legal underpinning to allow it?
So as we look at the soil samples, if we see concentrations that are of concern to human health and the environment, we're going to mitigate. So this is a very practical, deliberative engagement. So presumably, sediments in the river channel, if they wash out onto the floodplain, we need to be knowledgeable of that. And if they have an impact on communities, we want to be knowledgeable of that. And if there is a concern, we want to mitigate it. So this is a very practical engagement.
You also noted, you've recently said that the EPA is interested in expanding the scope of its assessment of the Hudson to include the lower portion of the river, perhaps all the way down to New York City. That is, of course, that's a significant expansion of the work that's been done today.
It is, and again, it was included, to my knowledge, it was included in the early assessment to determine where the highest priority was. So the highest priority became the Upper Hudson. So there was some preliminary studies. Some preliminary studies were conducted in the lower. We're going to go back. We're going to revisit those studies, collect more information, and then determine if, in fact, there's a reason for us to engage with remediation as far as we need to go.
I'm sorry. I've got questions here that we still need to get to. So I'm going to summarize a number of, or not summarize, but kind of bring together the subject of a number of questions that we received from the audience, and that was on the subject of climate change. There is scientific...
That one was coming too.
Oh yes, you knew that was coming. There is a scientific consensus, of course, that fossil fuel consumption has an effect on global climate change. There is not, at least in this nation right now, a political consensus on that question. When you were appointed, you said, I believe you told Joe Mahoney, that while you would not rule out human activity as a potential cause of climate change, you were not a scientist. You're still not a scientist, but you of course work with scores of them at EPA. Has your point of view changed on that question?
So I would say to you, and again, this has really come from the administrator. The administrators acknowledge the impact of human activity on the environment. So I don't think that's an undeniable aspect. Is human activity does have an impact. We're spending all our lives and careers cleaning up after human activity, intervening where human activity is causing serious impacts. So in terms of motion, I can't get too far ahead of my leadership. We've heard Mr. Pruitt talk about human actions and activities impacting the environment. I agree with that. My other premise is we know that there are impacts that we have to be mindful of. So if we see storm events that are more intense, if we see communities at risk, we're foolish to ignore that. And then that gets back to my issue of resiliency. That is very much alive in the conversations that I have on a daily basis, and very much part of the process of our engagement with EPA. And you'll be seeing that take place in Puerto Rico. And I'll just share an area where we're having a little bit of creative energy. We're going to be doing back to the issue of resiliency, and the grid has been an issue in Puerto Rico. The energy has made it much more complicated in terms of responding. But we're ready to embark on an analysis of the islands of Culebra and Vieques to see if we can develop power systems that allow them to be freestanding, with battery backup. So that's beyond having a cable connecting them to the main island. We're also going to be experimenting with the prospect of developing an energy system and battery system that could allow them to be self-sufficient or even off the grid. So the issue of resiliency also means allowing individual communities to be able to function where they live and work and be out of harm's way. So Mr. Pruitt has talked about the potential impact of human activity. We subscribe to that, I get that. And the other aspect is we see the results of intense storm activity. We can't be turn a deaf ear to that.
I do want to get back to the question of the EPA budget, which, under all the proposals that have been put out there, represents a cut of roughly a quarter of the budget. Of course, the agency has seen numerous buyouts, resignations, a stream of people going out the door. I'm sure that you've seen it within your district as well. How do you feel about the agency's, is the agency suffering what might be seen as a death, or at least a diminution of 1,000 cuts from the change of administration?
So
the change in policy.
Yeah, so in terms of the function, so I have upwards of, sweetheart, about 1,000 employees spread out between New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, etc. In terms of our function, we have a staffing plan that responds to the proposed cuts from the administration. And that plan allows the individual units to function and allows them to continue their mission. So whether it be Superfund or Water Division or Air Division or Enforcement, which is something that has to be in the toolbox, there's a staffing plan and allocation that allows the Region 2 to continue its mission and function. So I don't see that, if those cuts were to occur, I don't see that as preventing us from doing what we need to do and move forward. The other piece of the equation is that the administrative proposal is not in a vacuum. And as a former legislator, I get that. So the House of Representatives, the U.S. Senate all have a say in the ultimate outcome. To me, we're prepared if that number that's proposed by the administration comes to fruition, we're prepared to work with that. If it doesn't, that's really a function of the executive and legislative branch.
There's already been from the legislative branch a significant pushback on a lot of those, the deepest aspects of the cuts.
So institutionally, we internalized it, we've digested it, we know what we need to do to continue our mission, and then we just continue until we're told otherwise.
A last question. Since taking this job, what has, yeah.
One last piece, and
Sure.
this is important too for the audience, is that the Superfund piece is unique to the extent that much of it is almost exclusively driven by the responsible parties. So that is a
The
lot of
polluters, in other words.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And so that is above and beyond any appropriation provided through Washington. So that funding is what drives mitigation, analysis, to some extent staff support. And that's been reinforced by the administrator. So that is not being diminished, that's actually being highlighted as a critical function.
Since taking this job, what has perhaps been either a zone of contamination or a pollutant that you were perhaps not familiar with when you were in the legislature, or even before in your career as a legislative aide? What is something that you have made a study of over the course of the last, I guess it's been 6 months now, that made you go, oh my God, you've got to be kidding me?
Wow. I would say...
In other words, what's the next PFOA? That's something that kind of burst on the...
Yeah, so that's where I was heading. And I would say, certainly the administrator has taken the issue of emerging contaminants to bear. So he's extremely focused, we're extremely focused on the PFOS, PFOA aspect, and the next, the related family, Gen X, which is manifests itself, I think in North Carolina, it's that Cape Fear River with DuPont. We are very focused on that issue, and so it's driven by two things. One,
And Gen X, I'm sorry, if you could just give a capsule explanation.
so Gen X, in my understanding, is it just follows. It's similar to PFOA. It's just the more recent substitute for PFOA. It's next generation Gen X.
Mhm.
So
As a member of Gen X, I
not
take
as a, no,
exception
yeah, so
to that.
I didn't label it, so
All right.
no, I didn't
Okay.
label it, so my apologies.
Yeah.
So we're not going to throw you in with emerging contaminants.
Good.
So I'd rather not. So power of the pen, so I'm very respectful. So that piece in particular, so at the administrator's request, there has been a task force created which is working with the regions to identify areas of known contamination, understand the contamination, understand the extent of it. So again, in New York, it's not just Hoosick Falls, it's also Newburgh. So Newburgh is part of that same conversation. So that piece in particular is driven by two things. One, we've become better at tracking. And so we can detect contaminants at lower and lower thresholds. The challenge is, and this is where we are with EPA, is determining where do those thresholds present risk to health and the environment. And in the air we breathe and the water we drink, there's something in there, either naturally or not naturally in there. The question is it at a level that is detectable, one, and two, is that detectable level, can we wrap our arms around it enough to determine what risk it may propose to health, to individuals and their health? So that, and again, this would be the bane of any industrialized nation, where understandably, and we've gone through our industrial era, we now see China and India going through their industrial era, so to speak, unparalleled, where you have rapid growth and lack of knowledge of what chemicals are, where they go, how they're disposed of. That is probably one of the most serious elements that we're dealing with right now.
We are right at our stop time, so I would like to take a moment to thank you very much for coming in.
Yeah, my pleasure.
As someone who is a firm believer in the necessity of public officials coming and answering questions, easy questions, harder questions, I really appreciate your taking the time. I hope you will come back as your busy duties allow to speak again on some of these issues, and unfortunately on the issues that will come up again. And at this point, I would like to thank the audience as well for coming, and please give a round of applause to our guests.